we're going into the testing in the Marshall Islands. How do you recall knowing about that, and how you reflect being aware of it, and what the coverage was?
Well, you couldn't be unaware of it. It was reported. But it was reported in a way which I recall as being rather cool. We're doing this in self-defense. Nothing much about it was known that the islanders were expelled, that they were exposed to radiation, that some of the islands were practically blown away. But we have to do this in self-defense. We're obviously not going to land missiles on our own territory. That's taken for granted. So it's the way you treat the natives. It is so normal in Western history that it hardly raises an eyebrow. That's the whole of modern Western history. After all, why are we sitting here? Why not the people who were here when the colonists came? Well, we all know the answer, but we don't think about it much. The indigenous population was simply expelled or exterminated. And that's how the national territory was conquered. It was known by the people who were doing it. John Quincy Adams, later in his life, after his own major role in these atrocities was over, regretted what he had done to what he called, I think his phrase was, that hapless race of North Americans which we are exterminating with such savagery and felicity, or something like that. De Tocqueville describes the Andrew Jackson's driving of the Cherokees out, and describes how it was done. He says there's never been an atrocity which was carried out with a more, I wish I could remember his words, with a higher sense of self-righteousness and self-congratulation and deep morality and so on. That's a good bit of the history of the West, and it transmits itself into the treatment of the lower orders, as they're considered, as the appropriate victims. Doesn't matter much. It goes right on till today. One of the major U.S. bases, military bases, for attacking Iraq and maybe Iran if they do it, and other operations in the region, is Diego Garcia. It's a British-held island, the Indian Ocean, which had inhabitants. The U.S. wanted to build an air base there. The British kicked out the inhabitants. The U.S. They're off in Mauritius, surviving somehow, Chagos people. They did put claims forth in the British courts, which ultimately they won. The British courts recognized their right to be returned to their island. The British government just overruled it. And managed to get another court decision which overruled it. And meanwhile, the Americans go ahead and build their bases there. It doesn't matter what happens to these people. It's a stream that runs right through high culture, leading intellectual culture, that there are people who matter and people who don't matter. And we're the people who matter. And the others are people who don't matter. So therefore, we do, out of benevolence, what's good for the world, as namely ourselves. And what happens to them is maybe unfortunate, but they're undeserving. This is so explicit in Western high culture that it's kind of like second nature. In fact, it's supported, but it's fortified by a very valuable technique of historical amnesia. The powerful, simply forget. History looks very different depending on which end of the club you're holding. You hold the club, it looks one way. You're beaten by it, it looks a different way. That's the victors, the people holding the clubs, are constantly amazed that the subjects who they think claim to be treating so benevolently don't like them. This is the "why do they hate us" line. here we've been expending our blood and energy and effort to help them and raise them and Christianize them and so on, and they hate us. What's the matter with them? You know. On the other hand, you look at it from the other end of the club, it's quite a different story. That's true probably in every human relationship, from families to international affairs. If you look at a family where there's domestic abuse, you're going to get quite a different story from the abuser and the abused. And they'll remember it differently. And that extends itself into history, and I'm not talking about uneducated rednecks, I'm talking about the peak of scholarship and commentary. The framework is simply taken for granted. And it reflects itself in things like you described. I mean, if the Marshall Islanders and so on have to suffer, their islands are blown away, their lives are destroyed, well, it's all for the good of peace and justice, which we represent by definition, so what we do is right. I mean, that's the fundamental framework for describing almost everything. Just pick it at random. I mean, say, take the invasion of Iraq. I mean, the way it's described, you can debate this and that question about how events are covered, but the framework is simply can't be missed. I mean, the framework is very much like a school newspaper describing its local sports team. I mean, it does not ask the question, should they win, or do they have a right to win, or anything like that. The only question that can be asked is, how do we win? Did the coach make a mistake? Did one of the players make an error? Should we have used this tactic rather than that tactic? And that's the way wars are described. There's no question that we're right, and we should win. And the only problem is how much it's costing us. And if anyone's getting in our way, they're, terrorists or irrational or hysterics or something or other. And we have a right to do anything we want to them. We can throw them in prison without trial. We can torture them. We can send them all over the world. We can do anything we want because we're right. And that gives us the right to do everything. That's so deeply rooted in imperial culture that it's invisible.